Okay, welcome everyone. This is next up is Andrew Darling's presentation. And I just want to, if you're new to this format, I just ask you to remain muted. I have muted everyone already, but please remain muted for the duration of Andrew's presentation. And then of course, when he finishes and opens it up to questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Let me say a few words of introduction and then Andrew will get underway. Andrew Jacob Darling was born on August 20th, 1997. I noticed when I was putting these presentations together that that's the same birthday as Manny Mora, another presenter this year. Also the feast of Saint Bernard, the great Cistercian reformer. Andrew's hometown is Plano, Texas. Next year, he plans to continue full-time as director of junior high ministry and faith formation at All Saints Catholic Church in Dallas. Andrew's favorite movie is October Sky, and his favorite food is mac and cheese. His favorite class at UD has been moral theology with Dr. Alexander. Andrew claims as patrons St. George, St. Thomas More, and Blessed Stanley Rother. So let's call on these saints, Saints George, Thomas More, and Stanley, to assist Andrew as he presents on Catechesis Today, Essentials of Catechesis with an Adequate Anthropology.
All right, thank you, Dr. Waltz. Hello, everyone. Let me see if I can get my screen shared here. I've got a presentation for you. Dr. Walls or others, is that good? Can you see?
That looks good to me. And just to tell people, if you want to see more of Andrew's face, you can kind of slide it over a little bit and put speaker view on and have almost a 50-50 look if you'd like to do that. But it looks good, Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you. Just want to make sure that it was actually going through. Let me know if it cuts out at any point or anything. So, all right. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Walls and all for joining. Today, I want to talk to you all about catechesis. And to start out, sorry, one moment here. To start out, what do we see in the scripture about catechesis? What is it? What are some of our good foundation stones here? First, I've got these two quotes, one from Matthew, one from Acts. The one on the left is the most important. It's the one that I made. I gave it a whole page in my thesis. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. As from Jesus to the apostles, just before the ascension, I believe. And it's called the Great Commission by many. And it's the mission of the church in many ways, among other things. But it's a pretty central part of what the mission that Jesus gave the church is. We see this image of the church on the right there in Acts. This is just a short portion of the section that describes the early church, where it says they devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles and to the communal life, to the breaking of the bread and to prayers. All came upon everyone, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. So we see this image of the church. We see, the church living out this mission that Jesus gave them. And yet also we have today, what do we see? How do we see the church? Not that there's so many differences in time and place and culture and everything between the last, over the last 2,000 years. But I wanted to illustrate it by giving a brief story. I teach a confirmation class at All Saints, and the first day of the year, one of my students asked, we were talking about the year, talking about what we were going to cover that year, and how the class was going to go. And at some point, I mentioned something about the Mass, and we're really present there, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and all of this. And this kid looks at me and very earnestly asks me, "Wait, Jesus died?" And I was kind of surprised at that, to say the least. I mean, obviously this kid was a baptized Catholic. I don't know if he, had been in any faith formation classes before or anything, but he grew up in a Catholic home, and he'd gotten to this point in his life and still hadn't really heard this essential part of Christianity and what it is And that seems like a problem. It did to me then, and it's something that I've been thinking about throughout this year. Just to go another step further, obviously the statistics don't tell the whole story, just like the story doesn't tell the whole story. But it's just a brief graphic from the Pew Research Center showing how many Catholics leave the church. Some come back. It all seems to go together on showing this issue of there's something up in the church. And it seems like we're not entirely fulfilling the mission that Jesus Christ gave us. In some ways we are, but in some ways we're falling really short. So what do we do to remedy that? Well, here's how I want to approach that today. I want to approach the issue of catechesis and what it ought to be versus what it is by first talking about what is the human person. Obviously, the human person is pretty basic part of catechesis. He's the student and the teacher. So it's worth noticing what he is and who he is and how should we act because of that. Secondly, what is catechesis? What does the church say? What does theology say about what catechesis is and ought to be? And then at the end, how should catechesis look because of those two? What implications do those have as general principles and specific things for how catechesis should really look? So on the right is just a brief outline of what the rest of the presentation is going to be, and it follows those three questions in that order, more or less. So let's get going. First off, man. Why does it matter that we have an adequate anthropology? That's something that I had in my subtitle at the beginning. Why does it matter that we have this proper understanding of man when we're talking about what catechesis ought to look like? I wanted to read this brief section from John Paul II's Theology of the Body. I'll be drawing a lot from John Paul II throughout this presentation, as well as some others. So he's talking about his own, that term adequate anthropology is actually his term in this book. And so he's talking about that and why it's important. And he says, this integral vision of man can easily be rejected and replaced by many partial conceptions that dwell on one or another aspect of the compositum humanum, but do not reach man's integrum or leave it outside their field of vision. Various cultural tendencies then insert themselves here that are based on these partial truths, and on this basis make their proposals and practical suggestions for human behavior, even more often about ways of relating to man. So you see the Holy Father here is pointing out that if we don't have a proper understanding of the human person and what man is, other views are going to come in and change. Not just, it's not an isolated part of philosophy or theology. It's a central part of how we ought to treat other people, what human is, what the human person is, and how we ought to act. What is our goal? What is our nature? And so I wanted to give just kind of, obviously, the topic of what is the human person is at UD. It's actually the subject of an entire class, but it's its own field. So it's I feel like I'm doing it an injustice by giving it just a couple of slides, but I wanted to present a couple of really important points, just some of the most essential ones, as presented by St. John Paul II. So in some of his earlier essays, he was a philosophy professor. He wrote about what we call personalism, and he presented this understanding of the human person that really takes the best of all that came before him, I think. And so we have the objective view of the human person. As Aristotle would say, the human person is a rational animal. As Boethius would say, a person is an individual substance of a rational nature, and St. Thomas kind of builds off of those and sticks to that. And it's this very clear understanding of the person from the outside. And yet there's also this subjective view, which comes really more into focus later on in our history and in the history of philosophy and theology. I had to put Descartes on there because he's kind of the central part of where this comes from. But the idea that not only can you describe, it doesn't fully describe man to say that he is a rational animal. Man is the one who thinks. Man is the one who acts. The person is the one who has thoughts. And so John Paul II, in some of his essays and a lot of his works, really takes these and shows how they are at least the best parts of them are compatible. And it really paints the beautiful picture of the human person that seems to encapsulate most of what he is. Obviously, man is still a rational animal. He is still, the body and soul unity. He is all of those things that you can say from the outside, but he is also the agent of his actors, the agent of his actions. He is the one who thinks, he is the one who knows. And that's important, as we're going to come back to for all sorts of things, but especially in catechesis. Some more points here from the theology of the body. Straight out of Scripture, straight out of Genesis, that man was created in the image and likeness of God, that he is good, and he is created with a need for community, as he's based off the image and likeness of the Trinity, which is a communion of persons. We'll come back to some of the implications of these as well later. He also has the whole first section is about these original states of man after creation with Adam and Eve. Original happiness, original innocence, the original goodness and blessedness that in some sense, although further, we are restored to in salvation. And of course, we have the fall. We didn't just stay as those originally happy and innocent persons. We fell. We encountered sin, which darkens our intellect and darkens and compromises our will. And so, as he will say, and as the next point under Gaudium et Spes also points out, while man does have a darkened sort of knowledge of himself and of God and of other things, he is still in some way able to know and love God. And I bring up Gaudium et Spes. I know it technically wasn't written by St. John Paul II, but there's a whole lot of connection to him. There's a lot of speculation that he probably wrote it. Even if he didn't, it lines up very well with a lot of the things that he puts forward about the human person and comes back to in his later writings afterward. So another thing about the human person here, the man is a social being. Like I said, he's created in the image and likeness of God, inasmuch as the Trinity is a communion of persons, a communio. A man desires that. Man, it's part of his nature. Again, as I mentioned, body and soul unity, as Aristotle would say, this hylomorphism, that man is not just a body with some kind of other stuff going on. He's not just a spiritual thing that just happens to have a body, a ghost in the machine, as I think the police would call it. He is a unity of both of these things. We'll come back to why that's significant, especially in catechesis later on. And lastly, I want to show you this quote for this one, that Christ reveals man to man. In Gaudium et Spes, this is a really important section of this document. I want to just read it for you. That in the reality, it is only in the mystery of the Word made flesh that the mystery of man truly becomes clear. For Adam, the first man, was a type of him who was to come, Christ the Lord. Christ, the new Adam, in the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, fully reveals man to himself and brings to light his most high calling. So this is straight from the documents of Vatican II, that Christ is the way that man knows man. It's the only way that he can know himself and know others. And it's the only way that we can really look through that lens as well. So something to point out, which again, we're going to come back to, both catechists and those being catechized are human persons. I've got these pictures here, Augustine, obviously, who was a human person. And I believe it's the child Jesus, and we'll get back. He's not, there's a couple of philosophical distinctions that need to be made there, but we'll come back to those as well. So there's just a very, very almost unjustly brief description of the human person. And we're going to come back once we've combined it with this view of catechesis itself and what catechesis is. So in my research, I put together kind of three crucial dimensions of catechesis. The first of which is evangelization. And we hear the word evangelization often, and that we think of like a missionary or somebody going door to door, or there's any number of things like that. And yet, as our Holy Father Pope St. Paul VI writes, there is a very clear connection between these two things. They're not exactly the same, but as he says in his encyclical Evangelii Nunciandi, within the whole process of evangelization, the aim of catechesis is to be the teaching and maturation stage. So catechesis is a part of evangelization. Now there's so much to be said about that. That could be a whole paper on its own. But we have to recognize that this is a dimension of catechesis. Catechesis is a part of evangelization. If you're going to undertake the work of catechesis, we have to remember that it is a part of the entire process of evangelization. Within the Great Commission, Jesus asks us to go and make disciples. It's a crucial part of that. It's not something that is on the exterior of what's going on in the church. Second dimension here I want to mention is discipleship. There's this quote from John Paul II, again, in Catechesis Today, one of his encyclicals, or excuse me, those are both, I believe, apostolic exhortations, not encyclicals. Here he gives a pretty good description, definition really, of what catechesis is. He describes it as an education of children, young people, and adults in the faith, which includes especially the teaching of Christian doctrine, imparted, generally speaking, in an organic and systematic way, with a view to initiating the hearers into the fullness of Christian life. I want to focus on, again, if we're talking about discipleship, the second half of this quote, the idea that the essential part of catechesis is initiating those being catechized into the fullness of Christian life. So it's not just an imparting of facts. It's not just a filling up, a bucket with information, and it's about a way of life. It's about actually making disciples. Again, as part of evangelization. That's an aspect of this that can't be ignored. Lastly, instruction. I put this picture up here sort of ironically, but instruction, again, going back to this definition, it'd be an education of children, young people, and adults in the faith, which includes the teaching of Christian doctrine imparted in an organic, systematic way. The instruction of the facts of the faith, if you will, the particular things, the content of the faith, it's important. It is an essential part of catechesis. We can't ignore that either. And so, again, speaking of the content of catechesis, how it's imparted, one model that I found was really effective, or just seemed to really do a good job of encapsulating everything, was the Catechism of the Catholic Church, written recently, just within the last few decades, I believe. It has 4 sections, and again, I could talk about any one of these things all day, but faith, sacraments, liturgy, and ecclesiology, morals, and spirituality. And again, even the Catechism shows us that it's not just, the work of catechesis is not just imparting facts. It's not just describing what happened, what we believe, but it is actually an introduction into the life of believing that. It is an introduction into the initiation into that life of faith. So, putting all this together, what does all of this mean? Again, I've said a number of things, but what does this really mean for catechesis? And I don't want to get super particular. Obviously, there's a lot of particular, programs, curriculums, thoughts about things in different places. There's a lot of that discussion is worthwhile, but it's not exactly what I'm trying to get to today. I'm trying to get to some general principles that I think are challenging enough on their own. So, what are some of these general thoughts? I found myself using the word student a lot as I was writing, and I realized that something else was going to more fully explain what I was getting at actually at the whole in this paper. And so I ended up using and just kind of put these words together, student disciples. Again, going off that idea that this is not just a class. This is not just any classroom. This is not like reading, a book of all of Christian dogma. The work of catechesis is and should be a full initiation into the Christian life. And so if we are to be making disciples, we ought to consider that. And so that's why I use that term and threw that in here as well. Accounting for man's subjectivity and objectivity. Again, we can't just throw facts at someone at any age and expect them to just kind of soak it up. We have to acknowledge that faith involves assent to belief, assent to God's will. We can't ignore the fact that there is an internal universe, if you will. There is a soul and a will and a heart within all people being catechized. We have to give them the room for that assent, not by compromising any of the other aspects, but we have to acknowledge that this is a journey, and all of our students, all of our children are going to be in different places, and we have to acknowledge that in conjunction with everything else. Accounting, more than ethics, resurrection. As Pope Benedict said, I believe in Deus Caritas Est, Christianity is not an ethical system. It is more profoundly and fundamentally a relationship with Jesus Christ in his salvation. I butchered that quote, but the idea is that those who, there's a tendency to limit Christianity in some circles to just making good people bad, making bad people good. And I think that the important thing, again, coming from what we said earlier, is that the paradigm should be, it's not about making bad people good. It's about bringing dead people to life. It's about the salvation that Jesus Christ brought us and bought for us on the cross. Another important thing here, again, with the accounting for objectivity, accounting for fallenness. We can't pretend that we're teaching angels. We can't pretend that our children, our students, our parishioners, our fellow Christians are angels when we're trying to accomplish this task of catechesis. What that means is we can't just throw things at them and assume that they're going to act on them. We have to train those that are being catechized to actually live the faith as a person who experiences the state of fallenness, who has a darkened intellect, and we have to account for that. One model that I think, of course, works with that is Aristotelian virtue, the idea that you build these habits of good choices, of working towards your natural end and your fulfillment and your happiness, which does account for the fact that you start out elsewhere. Accounting for bodiliness, I put a couple of things in there, probably too many, but the idea that if man is a body and soul, and one is not, he's not just a soul. We can't just talk about the information of the faith or the spiritual life. We have to teach that through the body. We can't just ignore that as a factor in catechesis. Some ways that I brought up here in my paper to account for that: peer interaction, actually learning in a community, talking to other people. This is something that we're struggling with now in all sorts of ways. Not to mention this exact presentation. I'm talking to you through a computer. It's something that we're starting to find is really important, to actually being present and hearing and speaking with and seeing and interacting. Learning from example, learning from the example of others, learning from the example of catechists and parents and teachers. Actually seeing someone genuflect when you walk into a church has a profound impact on someone with a body who can reverence Christ in that way. Participation in liturgy and prayer, actually taking the students or your children to the liturgy, to the church, seeing the church itself, and going through the actions of the Mass, things like that. Actually praying in a religious ed class together. I think these are things that we can't ignore. Other things as well, experiencing works of charity. This is something that a lot of, I noticed, programs do. They require service hours, but there's ways. It's important to note that actually living a life of a disciple, if you're going to be learning how to do that, you ought to witness others doing that, and you ought to have the chance to do those sorts of things as you're growing as a disciple. Lastly, learning through beauty. Again, all of these could be a whole topic of their own. The way that a beautiful church or beautiful stained glass window or a beautiful liturgy or a piece of art or music or any of these things can express the reality of God. People can argue about goodness or truth, but beauty is one that for many people is a little bit more piercing and a little bit more accessible. And so I think that it's something we ought to keep in mind, that we have bodies, we enjoy art, we enjoy beauty. We ought to use these things in the work of catechesis to draw others to Christ, who is beauty itself. And lastly, the personal witness of catechists. The idea of in some places I've been, there's these great box sets kind of programs for catechesis, especially in parishes, or there's lesson plans and things of that sort, and you can't just read that. Again, part of the bodiliness of a human person and the idea that you have to assent to faith is that you really ought to. It's so much harder to take what you see as just a video or something and learn from that. Seeing somebody actually live their faith and hearing about what God has done in someone's life is significant for someone going through catechesis. Last section here, I think I'm running out of time, so I'll try not to go too much longer, but the preparation of catechist is something that in my work, it came up as a significant part of what the church can do about this, to put these things into place. as I got on the left, the Last Supper, it's, one of those many moments, but one of the most important, when Jesus taught his apostles. He formed them as his own disciples in the Christian life. And I think that the amount of preparation that a lot of our catechists of any kind have is really limited today. And in my own experience, I think that working on that would be something that we can, that we as any people at any level or any kind of person in the church can access. First off, parents. Obviously, this is a picture of Saint Therese and her family and her parents, Saint Zélie and Louis Martin, who are saints because they lived their vocation of parenthood as catechists. They undertook this work of bringing their children to God, bringing all of them into the life of the church. Not just because they all became religious sisters, but because it was clear in the writings and all that we know that they really did what we were talking about earlier. They really brought their children into that ongoing relationship with Christ and his church. Where we quote here from the Catechism, parents have the first responsibility for the education of their children. The home is well suited for education in the virtues. This requires an apprenticeship in self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery, the preconditions of all true freedom. The underlining is my doing there. So parents have the first responsibility for their education. Something that we as the church can do and perhaps change in our viewpoint on catechesis regarding all of this is that, parish faith formation programs are great. They are a fantastic supplement to what should be primary, which is that the faith ought to be learned at home. Children have the right, and it's a significant part of growing in the faith. It's the primary part of growing in the faith for children to learn from their parents the faith. And that word apprenticeship, I like that, because again, it goes back to, this is not just about teaching the doctrine. This is not just about memorizing scripture or anything like that. This is about learning and growing in a way of life and in a relationship. Secondly, after parents, pastors, St. John Vianney, of course, one of the patron saints, the primary patron saint of priests. Pastors have a role. Obviously, faith for the preparation. Well, preparation for parents is fairly minimal, and that's something that we can work on. The preparation for parents as catechists is minimal. The preparation for priests today is fairly thorough. As those of you who are seminarians know, it takes quite a few years to get through seminary and to do all the growing you need to do. But I think that there's always work to be done in terms of how catechesis ought to be run in an actual parish. What are some models of how this looks in a parish that you can implement when you're in a parish, and what are some ways that you yourself, as the person that your flock sees the most, what are some ways I think we can learn that to do the work of catechesis as a priest? I think that that's something that we can continue to develop in church. Teachers, again, thinking specifically of those who I would more narrowly call catechists, or directors of faith formation, or youth ministers, or directors of RCIA. Again, this is not just children, this is adults that we're talking about. They have a very important role. I think that preparation for them is very significant. That's kind of the point of all this last bit, that having, they have to know the faith if they're going to teach it. They have to live the faith if they're going to teach it. You can't teach what you don't know. You can't give what you don't have. And I think that the church can go a long way in the work of catechesis by preparing those who do this work more specifically in official roles, as well as parents and pastors. These sort of teachers are prepared. They know the faith, they live the faith, and they are prepared to do this work of catechesis. And lastly, all the faithful. There's a quote that I'm not going to show you from I believe it's from Catechesis Today, that all the faithful have a role in the work of catechesis. Again, it's part of the Great Commission. It's the one thing that Jesus said right before he left. Well, not the one thing. It's one of the main things that we hear from Jesus. We call it the Great Commission. And the document says that not only are all the faithful, not only do they have a role in teaching the faith to those under their care, but they have a role in welcoming those being catechized into the church. So think about the parishes we come from, where how many people really see the RCIA as something that's part of their responsibility in their faith. How many of them see welcoming those people and caring for and looking out for the youth of the parish something that is their responsibility, something that we can, even just the awareness of, I think would go a long way in the church. So lastly, I want to just leave you with this quote. Christocentricity in catechesis also means the intention to transmit not one's own teaching or that of some other master, but the teaching of Jesus Christ, the truth that he communicates, or to put it more precisely, the truth that he is. Jesus Christ, here obviously this is the transfiguration on the right. The work of catechesis is about bringing those under our care and those around us into relationship with Christ. And there are many stages of that. Catechesis is a really essential one. I think it's one that the church has put a lot of energy into in recent years. And I think that some more guiding principles like this, further in alignment with the human person and with the teachings of the church, would go a long way in helping us to achieve this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we have a few minutes for questions if anyone would like to ask. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Darling.
Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, just briefly, this is kind of an odd question, but in your work as a youth minister of sorts and just in general ministry, I wonder if you have anything to say on kind of the gender gap that we can run into in catechetical and ministerial situations. Like a lot of times, just looking at numbers, these things seem to get through more to women than men. Most Catholic laity are women, and we know that. And I wonder if you have any insight into maybe where the breakdown is with men, if there's some way in which we're failing to reach out to them in particular, and what we can do about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. That's a really great question. There's a whole lot to that I frankly don't have all of the information about, but yeah, like I was saying, the one thing that we some things that kind of affect that, especially with the youth, the different ages of maturity. Obviously, as we know, girls tend to mature a little bit earlier on than boys, as far as I know, and that's something that we have to acknowledge. Again, going back to the subjectivity of the human person in catechesis, we can't just assume that everybody in the room, if we're doing youth ministry or faith formation or as a parent, we can't assume that all of these kids are equally willing to listen to what I have to say, or to learn. They all learn the same way, and it's I think that's something that would go a long way towards that. Is that going to answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
I think another thing with that, sorry, just to add, I'm thinking of here, the bodiliness, I think, is something that, especially with boys, might be something that, they tend to be, athletic and rough, and they want to get their hands dirty and they want to do wild things. Like learning to take advantage of, that side of children, and teaching them and leading them into the faith.
For sure. Maybe.
Yeah, thank you.
Andrew, I'm wondering if you could say just a few words about the oft used phrase new evangelization and what you understand to be new about it, and maybe in particular, given your focus on a number of documents by JP2, what he brings to the table in helping us to understand that new evangelization.
Sure. To tell you the truth, there's a lot behind that term that I haven't done a lot of research on in preparation for this. But my understanding is that the new evangelization is the idea that the church has this mission, and it's not the new evangelization is not new in what it's teaching. It's not new in what it's presenting. It's new in the manner in which it's presenting the faith, the manner in which it is leading those into into relationship with the church and with Christ. And so I believe, I know John Paul II was of course, a huge kind of central figure for that term, and still remains so to this day. I think it just comes back to looking at some of these principles from some of the church documents, and looking at, like, what are we actually doing to teach the faith to our children, our actual children, our children in the parish, to all the faithful, and how can we actually start to do that? How do we, if we find ourselves in the situation of where a student doesn't really know that Jesus Christ died and rose from the dead for his salvation, he's not really going to grow in faith very much. He's going to find it very hard, I would say. And obviously grace works around us and through us, but I think that the new evangelization is a good kind of central point to say, we ought to take this up with a new vigor. We ought to take up, not to, pretend we're the apostles, because it's not, we live in our own day and age, but to really take this up and say, what is the world like, and how can I bring Jesus into that world, and that world to Jesus in a more effective way, without compromising any of, innovating the manner without innovating any of the doctrine, the faith itself necessarily. So does that get at what you were?
Thank you. Any final questions for Andrew?
Yes, but I'm not sure if I'm using this correctly.
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Hello, Andrew. Thank
Yes.
you for such an outstanding presentation. I really enjoyed it. I myself am an 8th grade confirmation teacher and a catechist, and I loved how you talked about that parents are the first to be the ones to teach and role model. But I have a lot of disciples or students, whatever you want to call them, in my class who have been through the faith formation classes from 1st grade up to 8th grade. And I find that despite their parents' best foot forward to get them to, get to the last sacrament of confirmation, which is the last initiation rite into Catholicism, is very difficult. And although the parents are doing the best that they can, the children are refusing. They don't want it. How do you find the evangelization to challenge the student to find the grace that should be given? Because as we all know, it's the last full grace that falls upon them in the sacrament of confirmation.
Sure. I think just one thing on confirmation prep, obviously that could be a whole other topic, but just the presentation of it at any level by anyone in the church of, it's the graduation from church, from being a Christian. There's so much of that I think does harm to children right at that age who are beginning to prepare for that sacrament. It's obviously, again, there's so many particular things. I think it kind of goes back to what I had said earlier or just a minute ago, on the new evangelization of, catechists prepare themselves well for the faith, teachers and parents prepare themselves well for the faith, and they live the faith more fully. But it takes really looking at and understanding what the world is like for these kids. Who are these kids? What are their particular lives like? Where are they in their individual journeys? The word accompaniment has come up so much, especially from Pope Francis and other documents in recent years in the church. I think that's a good word to go with. I think that there could be more attention to the individual journeys of each of the students. All that being said, there is an element of, everyone has to make choices. You have to acknowledge and account for the fact that a student is going to have to choose faith, but we have to account for that fact by also accounting for that they might not. We have to prepare them as well as we can, but we can't. There's a certain element that we have to acknowledge their own freedom, and then also do everything that we can to show them. The word I'm looking for? Show them and demonstrate for them just how incredible the life of Christ is. So does that get at some of what you're asking there? I don't know if you. So.
I think it did. I can speak in her behalf. I'm going to unmute everyone. I'd like everyone to give Andrew a big round of applause for his presentation.
Congratulations. Awesome job.
Awesome. Good job, Andrew.
Thank you.
Well done.
Wonderful, Andrew.
Really well done.
Woo!
Good job.
Great job, Andrew. Great
Hey, go
job.
Good
Trees.
job.
Proud of you.
Come on, you're all our family. Josie, did you hear?
Okay, I just muted everyone. Not that I wanted to stop the applause, but we're going to take a break and then we'll be back for our final presentation with William Stice School.